Hello everybody. Welcome to what I think will be the first of quite a few little instructional videos from me where I'll go through some of the key parts of the course. Now hopefully before you watch this video you'll have had an opportunity to look at the syllabus for the course, and if you have, you'll see that the very first part, or at least the first part that I intend to look at, topic 1.1, is called Environmental Value Systems. So I thought it was worth just starting with a definition really of what environmental value systems are. That's not a simple question to answer though, really. Above my head you'll see the key terms for this lesson or this video. There are basically three environmental value systems: ecocentrism, technocentrism, and anthropocentrism. I won't go into detail about those yet, because before I cover that question, I think it's worth asking the question about what is a system. Again, if you've looked at the syllabus, you'll actually see that topic 1.2 is about the idea of systems. You'll also realise that the full title of this course is Environmental Systems and Societies. So that means that everything we look at in the course either refers to a system or it refers to effects on human society. That's worth bearing in mind. So I think even at this stage, before we get to section 1.2, it's worth trying to answer the question briefly, what is a system? So you can think of a system as being a black box, and within that black box, in this case a blue box actually, the important thing that occurs is a process. I hope you can read my writing. So a system is a methodology of processing. Let me make this look nice, change colours. Those processes can be one of two things. It could be a very simple level, it could be a transfer process, where something is just moved from place to place, or a bit more complicated, it could be a transformation process where something is changed into something else, basically. Okay, so you've probably realised something has to go into the system and something needs to come out. So we can label this as a input, and if something goes in, something must come out, so there must be an output. The inputs and the outputs can be one of three things, which you may have realised as well. The input could be matter, atoms basically, or it could be energy, for example sunlight. None of those things are referred to environmental value systems, however. The least common one we look at throughout the course is actually the one we look at today, which is information. That would also be the case for a computer system. You get information in and then information out. So the input's one of those three things and the output's one of those three things. I won't rewrite them. And the other thing is, it's worth noting, the output can have an effect on the input. And that would be called a feedback. Okay, so on a very basic level, that is the idea of what is a system. So let's move on to talk about environmental value systems. Or actually, before we do that, let me pose a question. I think it's an interesting question that's very, very difficult to answer. How much is a tree worth? Now on this little graphic on the left, I've taught this for many years now. I've actually never looked into how this guy actually made this calculation. But according to this, it says Professor T. M. Das of the University of Calcutta, India, estimated that a tree is worth $193,250 US. Now, I actually think it's a silly question to try and answer. I don't think that's a good answer. I think you can't put a value on something like a tree, and I don't think you can put a value on life, really. But I think it's worth looking at, because when this guy tried to come up with his answer, he was looking at another important notion to us, which is called the three pillars of environmental sustainability. And basically that concept states that environmental sustainability is held up by three things. One is social aspects, one is environmental aspects, and one is economic aspects. So again, throughout the course, we'll be looking at these three things. So what Professor Das tried to do, without going into too much detail, first of all, he took the economic value of the tree. Well, I guess that's just the cost of its wood, or the price you could get for chopping it down and selling it as wood. He tried to put a value on the social value. I guess that would include aesthetic beauty. It would include the added value that if somebody takes the wood and turns it into something else, the added value they put onto that, the social benefits. And most importantly for us, I think, it includes the environmental aspects. So for example, the cost of how much water a tree cleans within its lifetime, how much oxygen it puts into the atmosphere, how much carbon dioxide it takes out of the atmosphere, the homes it gives to animals and birds. So you can see, for a simple question, I don't think there's a very simple answer. Your answer to that question will depend on which of these three environmental value systems you believe in, or you adhere to, maybe. So for the rest of the video, I'll just talk through what those three things are. Okay. This is the kind of syllabus definition of an environmental value system. It's the processing of information within the three pillars of environmental sustainability, which shapes the way you as an individual or us as a society perceive and evaluate environmental issues. Three categories: ecocentrism, anthropocentrism, and technocentrism. I think this is very artificial, but you can think of them as lying on a spectrum. At the one end, you've got ecocentrism, which means your values are centered on what's good for the environment. On the other end, you would say environmental problems are all answered by technology. And in the center, you've got something like a center on human benefit, which would take both of those into account. Now, I think that's very artificial. In some ways, you can say your viewpoint depends somewhat like your politics. You can be left-wing, right-wing, or centrist, I guess. But I'll come back to this at the end and say why I think that's probably a little bit artificial to think of it lying on a spectrum. Although it is generally true that you can be a very hardline ecocentric, you can be very hardline technocentric, or you can be somewhere in between. Okay, number one, ecocentrism. If you're ecocentric, you're likely to distrust technology, especially if you're very far to the left of that spectrum. You'd probably be against capitalism in a lot of forms and against corporations. You would probably view humans as just being part of nature, as you can see in this diagram at the bottom. An ecocentric would say humans are neither at the top nor in the center; they're just part of the living world. And they would probably say it's wrong to think of humans as being at the pinnacle of life, and it's wrong to put nature at the whim of what humans need. If you're an ecocentric, you would probably say that the world definitely has finite resources and we need to look after them rather than just exploit them. You would believe that ecology is very complex and humans will never really understand ecology or our place within it. Again, if you're very, very hardline ecocentric, you'd probably be referred to as a deep ecologist. That's worth just spending a bit more time on. Deep ecology is a philosophy. It was founded by this guy. I hope I pronounced this right. His name was Arne Næss. He died in 2009. And he was a philosopher that basically believed humans, every living thing has a right to life, and humans need to respect that. And humans need to know their place within the environment. That doesn't mean that he was an anarchist. He wasn't saying that we just need to abandon society, but he said we can't go on living the way we are, thinking that we have finite resources at our disposal. I've said that he was profoundly influenced by the works of Gandhi and a woman we'll look at quite a lot in future, Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson wrote a book in 1967, in the summer of love, which was called Silent Spring, and it's widely thought of as being the very first book of environmentalism, and she's very often thought of as being the very first environmentalist and starting the environmental movement. Okay, moving on. Technocentrism. In some ways you could say it's the opposite of ecocentrism. In some ways you can say it's on the opposite end of that spectrum. A technocentric would be likely to trust technology is the answer to all environmental problems. A technocentric would believe that humans can be trusted to come up with solutions using technology for all these problems that might befall us. A technocentric would believe that humans have an ability and possibly a right to control nature. They would think that governments all have a duty to look to science and scientists to advise on public policy. And again, just as there are extreme ecocentrics, the deep ecologists, there are extreme technocentrics who we'd call cornucopians. So the cornucopians would be people that believe that we have infinite resources. We don't need to worry about the future because we'll always count on human ingenuity to come up with more and more technology to solve more and more problems. The cornucopia, by the way, was a piece of Greek mythology. It was the shell or the horn of plenty, where everything you could think of was available. So basically, everything was infinite. Okay, and finally, possibly the most difficult to get your head around, you might be somebody that has some aspects of the ecocentric within you, if you're an individual or a society, and some aspects of the deep ecologist and the technocentric. So an anthropocentric would be someone that sees humans as managers of nature rather than controllers. There'd be people that believe that population control is important, for example, and maybe technology has a role to play in that, for example, family planning. And they would believe that government has an important role in regulating human behaviour. Possibly we're all anthropocentrists to some extent. We're probably unlikely to be at one extreme or the other. But remember, maybe there's some value in saying that we're somewhere on a spectrum. I just added this picture. You're obviously too young to remember this film. Silent Running was a science fiction film produced in 1972. And it pretty much explored the ideas of ecocentrism, technocentrism, and where we lie in relation to those things. So just out of interest, it's the story of a guy, he's living in space in the future. Nature has pretty much been destroyed. I think the last tree is supposed to have been cut down years before. But humans have managed to create huge floating gardens in space. It's been a long time since I've seen this film, but this guy, Bruce Dern, great actor, he gets an order, him and his crew, he gets an order from the Earth that they need to return to Earth and they need to destroy these floating gardens they put in space. And he's against this. So as his crewmates start to destroy these gardens, he takes action. I don't want to spoil it for you, but he basically takes over these gardens and tries to protect them. So he's the ecocentric fighting against the technocentrics. I'm not trying to suggest that technocentrism is evil and ecocentrism is good in any way, by the way. Okay, so just to finish, I'll just return back to that graphic. These are the three environmental value systems: ecocentrism, anthropocentrism, and technocentrism. I think it's a little bit artificial to say that they're three separate things. I think we all have a blend of these things within us. In some way, I think we're all anthropocentrics. I'd like to give you a little piece of work based on this. And maybe the first thing you can do is decide if you were going to put a cross on this with regard to your own environmental value system, where you would put that cross and why. Okay, so I've probably gone on far too long. Hopefully that made sense. I'm going to set this with some work which you can work through and get back to me with any questions about this stuff. It's worth mentioning that the environmental systems in societies, it's not a course like physics or chemistry. In some ways, I would say it's a soft science rather than a hard science. It's not something where you're going to find easy answers, as you've probably seen from this video. You just need to decide what your answer is to a question, but you must also try always to justify that answer. Okay, take care, everybody, and take care of your families, and I'll speak to you soon.